All right. So, welcome to COVID University. This, I know this is a little weird for everybody, including me. I'm used to having everybody around, and I can interact with people and kind of, feed off of some of your energy. But I don't have that right now. And I have to produce these videos in such a way that I can get them out quickly. So the production value isn't going to be so high. So I apologize for that. Right off the bat. But adapt, improvise, and overcome, that's what it's all about. That's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to do things. So let's do this. Now this, interestingly enough, now you don't know this, but I'm just going to tell you, this is the second time I've done this video. The first time it was way too long, even for me. So I have to try to figure out a way to kind of cut this down a little bit. One of the ways I'm going to do that is I want you guys, I've included kind of a little pamphlet with some of the terms that we're going to be using, so that I don't have to go over the definitions and stuff like that that I was otherwise doing in the original video that took a little bit more time. So please take a look at that guide that kind of gives you the breakdown of the terms and a little bit of a review of what we had already been through before. So in the review, you'll see a Venn diagram of how we talked about the last theme we spent talking about, introducing the topic, right? We're talking about the existence of the family as an institution and what that means, and then we ended up talking about how that family institution overlaps with the economy, right? And then, so what we're going to do today is we're going to add another element, a layer of complexity to that. And now, a lot of the things that you're going to hear is going to sound kind of economic. And the reason for this is because of what we as sociologists refer to as political economy. So then on the little study guide that I've included, you'll see you'll see a Venn diagram that has the family and the economy, and then you'll have another one that has the economy and the state, and then the family and what we call the political economy, right? So now what we want to talk about is we want to talk about the relationship between the family as an institution and the state as an institution. And we're going to do this with a mechanism that you're already familiar with. You will see this, you will recognize it almost immediately. So I'm going to use this as my title. I'm just going to draw my line. We draw another line. And then we're going to have 3 columns. Alrighty? And now what we're going to do is we're going to divide these 3 columns in half a little bit. Alright? Next time I do these videos, I'll have a shirt that has something on my back so that you have something to look at when I turn my back to you. And you guys are all familiar with this this particular setup, right? Immediately you should be at the point where you're almost automatically going, all right, well, Mr. Andosha, this is obviously pre-industrial. This is obviously industrial. And this is obviously post-industrial. So now we want to take a look at the evolution of the relationship between the family and the state, all right, in terms of these 3 particular time periods. So take a look at this, and again, in the study guide, we'll kind of focus on exactly what I mean by pre-industrial. It's a little bit, that's kind of a nebulous term, so I wanted to get a little bit more exact with that one. But let's take a look. When we take a look at this, I want to also label this row changes, changes, and continuities. Okay? I mean, the reality is if you go back in time, into pre-industrial ages, you'll have a hard time getting along, but you'd probably be able to recognize families, and you'd probably be able to get along pretty well within families. You would understand the rules of those families a little, for the most part, right? There'll be some nuances that you won't get, but for the most part, you'll be able to understand that, right? So anyways, all right, let's get started. So think in terms of this. So what I want you to think about right now is I want you to actually kind of brainstorm real quick. Right? Think about all of the ways that the state is somehow involved in your families. All right? I want you to pause the video right now and take about 30 seconds to list all of the ways that the state is somehow in even the slightest way involved in your family decision making? Take about 30 seconds. All right. So you should have a pretty good list. I mean, there's all kinds of things that that are in existence now that that are involved. I mean, look, just the fact that you're sitting here right now watching this video, you would otherwise not be doing that, right? You would be watching something else other than me, as exciting as this is, right? Why are you doing it? Well, you're doing it because the state has decided that this is what you need to do to continue your education. And the state, you're deciding to continue your education because the state says that's something that you got to do. You don't really have a choice in the matter, right? So just this time that we're spending together-ish is a state intrusion in your family, right? It's a state, it's some kind of a state overlap in your family. Now think about all of the other ways that the state is somehow involved in your families, right? Think about the house or the apartment that you're living in is built according to certain specifications that were established by the state. It's on a piece of property that was defined and bounded by the state. You are accessing resources like electricity that's subsidized by the state and using utilities that are put in and mandated by the state. The material in the walls and in the buildings, the wiring in your walls is done to state specifications. The medicines in your medicine cabinet are governed by the state. Everything is just about everything that you can think of that has to do with your household is in some way infused with some kind of rule that is put into place by the state. Well, how did that happen? Where did that come from? That's what we're going to talk about today. All right. So when we take a look here at pre-industrial societies, we're going to take a look at pre-industrial societies, trying to think in terms of that family that existed in pre-industrial societies. That maybe they were peasants. All right, they were working the land. Maybe they were crafts or tradespeople that were working in their own workshops and things along those lines. Think about them, right? Just exactly how much interaction did those folks have with the state? Right? Think about that. Probably not an awful lot. So in this regard, right, we have in pre-industrial societies the interaction between the government and the state and the family is relatively little, right? There's very little interaction. I mean, maybe if something big happened, right? The king dies, you know, that might be important. You might want to know who the next king is going to be. A war is declared, anything like that. You know, those may be big deals, right? Because then the lord of the manor that owns the land that you're living on, your landlord, is probably going to come to you and say, hey, I need to extract more taxes from you. Or, hey, we're going to war, so you, and you're all in the army, let's go. I mean, those things might happen, but under normal circumstances, your interaction with the state is relatively minimal, right? And why? Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why this is because, for the most part, households were insular, right? Well, they're not entirely insular, but the term that we're going to use is internal functions. Internal functions. All right, these were largely self-sufficient households. Right, pretty much anything that you needed for survival, you got through your family, right? The resources that you needed, you got it through your family. Education, you got that through your family. If you were a male or a female child and you were a peasant, you were working out in the field and you learned how to work out in the field. You learned how to pick those crops and maintain those fields. If you were a tradesperson, craftsperson, you're working in the trade shop, right? You're working in the workshop. One way or the other, and for the most part, you're able to get access, especially the peasants, right? You're able to get access to the things that you need. You probably have your own plot of land, your own garden that you're able to grow your own food from, some of which you're allowed to keep for yourself, and you can even sell for a profit. But even these pre-industrial areas, again, we're looking at this through kind of a Eurocentric lens. But even those areas, they had what was called a commons area, that people would go out and they would share the commons. This was where you could graze your cattle. You could, if there was a rabbit, you could shoot the rabbit and you had meat to eat, right? There were ways that you could go about and get the stuff that you needed to survive. You didn't really need an awful lot of interaction with the state. You didn't really need an awful lot of interaction with anybody. In fact, you probably tried to avoid it as much as you possibly can. Interacting with a lord was probably more of an inconvenience than anything else, and it's something you didn't want to have to do. So you kind of tried to avoid those things. So there was very, very little interaction between you and the state. If you had a baby, you had the baby at home, and it was your relatives who were around you who helped you have the baby. Maybe somebody in your family was a midwife, right? If you had an upset stomach, Uncle Larry knew how to brew a particular tea that was good for stomach. You would get that. Anything that you needed. If you needed somebody to send a letter, there was probably somebody in your family who could write, and you would go to them and they would help you communicate, right? Just about everything that you needed, you got through your family connections. When one of the things that this leads to is the fact that extended family networks, of course, now these extended families are really important. So nuclear families are kind of integrated. So nuclear families. So these nuclear families are kind of integrated into these larger extended family networks, right? The extended families become really important. So we're kind of talking a bit about the fit thesis, right? And also, who's in charge of these families? Who's in charge of these families is largely men, right? So these families are what we call patriarchal. We're going to call these patriarchal family structures, right? The men are largely in charge. The men are the ones who are allowed to own property. They run the books, they keep the money, and all that other kind of stuff. So these are patriarchal families. Now, granted, most families didn't own property. They didn't have an awful lot of wealth. So the patriarchal element of those families was maybe relatively low for most families. The male was still, culturally in charge, but there was probably little real difference between the males and females in these families when it came to just real life, right? Men and women, if you were peasants, you were probably working out in the fields, pulling the same crops, doing the same labor. Even if you're a tradesperson, your wife is probably well versed in your trade, despite the fact that she's not allowed to be a member of that trade guild or what have you. So yes, so culturally speaking, men are in charge of this. But now, as you get higher in the class hierarchy, of course, these patriarchal family patterns are much more important, right? So let's move into these industrial societies, right? And as we move into industrial societies, what do we start to see? We start to see increased interaction with the state. Increased interaction with the state, right? Why? Well, think about it, right? Pre-industrial societies, you're probably living in or real nearby rural communities. You're living near commons areas. You have access to the resources that you need to survive, and the resources that you need to survive are not particularly complicated, right? You need food. You need clean water. And those things are probably relatively available to you. But as societies industrialize, we start to see what we call increased urbanization. Right? People are moving into the cities. They're moving into urban centers, right? And now it's very difficult to have access to the things that you need in these urban environments, right? And another thing, well, think about this. You've all heard, especially Cambridge students, you guys have all heard stories about early cities, right? Especially like the stories of the poop, right? The chamber pots. How in the urban centers, what you would do. I mean, if you lived in a rural place, you went to an outhouse, and that's where you did your thing. But in urban centers, the dogs are going crazy. If you go in the urban centers, you did your thing in what was called a chamber pot, and then you just chucked the chamber pot out the window, which created a real mess in those city streets, right? The city streets were just lined with feces and urine and vomit and whatever else there was, and it all just kind of flowed down the city. Now, we're talking about cities of 100,000, 200,000, and you can kind of imagine just the flies and all that other kind of, it would just be really horribly nasty. Well, now take those cities of 100,000, 200,000 and multiply that by 10. Now we're looking at 1 million, 2 million people all doing this? No bueno. Not good. We need to have rules. We need to have stuff in place, right? Also think in terms of how do we get the things that we need, right? Well, we no longer have like an efficient, in an urbanization situation, you no longer have efficient bartering, right? It's not like you have a piece of land and you can grow your crops and shear your sheep and stuff like that. No, if you're living in these urban centers, the chances are pretty good. You're living in these tenement buildings that were literally just thrown together, and you're probably living multiple families in a room, right? And in these early cities, these early industrial cities, as the populations of these cities exploded, buildings and houses, these things went up very quickly. There were no rules, there were no regulations for how these buildings were built and what they were made out of. Many of these things were just absolute fire traps with insufficient plumbing. There were no rules. There were no regulations, right? Overcrowded, overhoused, just things that are thrown together, really nasty stuff, right? And it doesn't take long before we realize that that's not just a personal problem, right? Having these, what were called slums at the time, right? These places where just impoverished people were stacked one on top of each other with these very cheap. These slums were no longer really just personal problems for poor people. No, because what ends up happening? We end up starting to see, right, all of the filth and all of the disgustingness and slime that comes out of those slums is washing down into the places where everybody else lives. Not only that, but you have inadequate sanitation. You have folks who are living in their own feces and stuff. So now we have outbreaks, cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, really nasty stuff, right? And we got to do something about this. We have to have rules and regulations put into place to deal with this kind of stuff. Especially, for instance, like fires, like the Great Fire in Chicago that wiped out the entire city. It happened because there were no rules. Most of the buildings in the city were basically made out of tinder, right? The whole city goes up, and that's a problem for everybody. Also, if you're living in an urban center, you don't have access to you can't grow your own crops. You can't use your own. You got to get your food from someplace else. You got to get your stuff from someplace else. You're not going to go down in the Chicago South Side and kill a deer and have food to eat, for weeks at a time because you were able to smoke the meat and dry the meat out and you were good. No, maybe you could kill a squirrel. That's not going to get you very far, right? And then there's always the problem of, well, you can't just go out into a crowded city area and shoot a squirrel. Because that bullet's going to go through that squirrel, and it's going to hit the guy across the street. Can't do that. No bueno. Not good. So we can't do it. There have to be rules and regulations that are put into place. And what is the institution that is there for putting rules and regulations into place? Well, that is the state. So now the state is going to be more involved in people's everyday lives, right? So what's happening as a result of this? What's happening as we start to move into these industrialized functions? Well, what's happening is more and more of the functions of the family are being externalized. So now what we're going to talk about is external functions. So for instance, in these pre-industrial societies, households were centers of production. Productive households, right? But here, your households are centers of consumption. Production takes place somewhere else, right? You go to work, right? So the household is where we're going to start buying stuff, right? The stuff that we need, we're going to buy that stuff from somewhere else. And if you're going to buy from somewhere else and you don't have the means by which to shear your own sheep or grow your own crops and sell your own and trade your own bread, you have to have a medium of exchange. And that medium of exchange has to be more reliable and more supported. And that medium of exchange is going to be more reliable because of the influence of the state. The state is going to say, you can use this piece of paper, you can use this coin to purchase the products that you need. And now, instead of, you using your labor for yourself, now what you're going to do is you're going to go out, and this is going to be capitalism, right? You're going to exchange your labor for wages and then use those wages to get the things that you need. So industrial societies are going to develop this idea of capitalism, right? It's no longer a barter situation. So we have these external functions, right? And this is going to mean, ultimately with regard to the continuities of how families look and what are the rules for running families, these continuities now, we're still going to have extended families. They don't just evaporate, right? But now we have family households. They become more insular. The extended families are in the community. You still have extended families, but they're now in the community. And now what's happening inside those families is we start to see what we call a gendered division of labor. And authority in the house becomes what we call asymmetrical. I have to look at the symmetrical. Right? Asymmetrical authority. So, yes, we've got a situation where you've got this is where we start to develop the traditions of women taking care of the domestic tasks and men taking care of the productive tasks. So men taking on the role of going to work, earning the wages, bringing the wages home, and using that to sustain the household. And whereas women are going to, the expectation is going to be that they're going to be taking care of the domestic tasks, maintaining the household. Again, in pre-industrial societies, not so much. Women and men did very, very similar work. Industrial societies, guess what? In the lower classes, that's still going to be the case. Women are still going to go into the workforce. They're going to be working in the factories. They're going to be working in the mills. In fact, their children are going to be doing the same thing. But as we move up in the class status, we're going to start to see a separation where it becomes a matter of status, where a mother or a wife is going to be staying at home and taking care of the domestic tasks. Husband is going to go off and do and earn the wages and bring in the bacon, so to speak, right? So now this gender division of labor becomes a matter of status. Hey, I as a man make enough money that my wife can stay home and do the household domestic tasks. So clearly we are not this lowly working class people where everybody in the household has to go out there and work. It becomes a matter of status and therefore becomes culturally ingrained. We still have a system of patriarchy, but that system of patriarchy is starting to break down a little bit, right? It becomes asymmetrical. So as the breadwinner of the household, I'm still expected to be the leader of the household, the head of the household. But let's face it, in many cases, the fact that my wife is taking care of the domestic tasks is still important. She's able to inherit my property. She's able to go out and make money on her own. She's able to start signing contracts and things like that. We're starting to see the patriarchy start to break down a little bit. Still exists, but it's starting to break down a little bit. Men are largely, the non-domestic labor is the stuff that's going to be privileged over the domestic labor because it's largely associated with men doing the work. Okay? So this is industrial households. Now, post-industrial households. Post-industrial households, what are we starting to see? Well, now we're going to see even more interaction with the state, right? So even more interaction. But it's going to be a little bit different, right? Because what we're starting to see is what we could call suburbanization or urban sprawl. Right? You got people who are now, because they have access to capital, they have access to loans and things like that, they can go out and purchase their own houses. They're going out into the suburbs. Well, what does this mean? Well, this basically means that people are going to move out into the suburbs because they want their own house and they want their own yard, and they're not growing crops. They just want grass to mow, apparently. And they're going out and they're getting this stuff, but they still want all the services that they get in the city, right? So that means that those city services are going to have to move outside of the city, and that means that the state is going to have to be more involved in that process, right? Now we have to not just take care of what's taking place in the city, but now what's outside of the city. So now larger state institutions are going to be involved in this process. We're spreading out. That means more sewers. That means more utilities. That means you can't have all of the people in the city subsidizing all of the people in the countryside for electricity. So that means the state's going to do this to try to accommodate these things so that everybody can have access to electricity. You know, things along those lines. So we're starting to see a lot more of the state involved in this stuff. And the rules. And what we're actually going to start to see is a phenomenon that we're going to refer to. You see how this was internal functions, all of the things that the family needed, it got from within the family. And then externalized functions. Externalized functions means these are things that the family is responsible for dealing with, but like education, but they're things that we're going to get from institutions outside of the family. Well, now in a post-industrial society, we start to recognize those functions as what we call peripheral functions. Peripheral functions. In other words, we no longer even really see things like education, healthcare, and, you know, midwifery and things like that as stuff that is the family responsibility. Those are things that we see as, we understand that people go to school to get their education. They don't get their education from mom and dad. People go to the hospital and they go to the doctor to get their health care. That's not something that they get in the family. So those functions become peripheral, right? They're separated. They're totally seen as separated from the family, right? And what does that mean? Well, that means for the family no longer really has to focus on these peripheral functions. So what does the family then end up focusing on? Well, then the family becomes, instead of being a locus of economics and practical reality, now what we have is emotionally bonded nuclear families. Right? We create nuclear families not necessarily for economic reasons or for even cultural reasons. We form nuclear families because we've formed an emotional attachment, an emotional bond with the other person, right? So, these family functions become emotionally based, and that means there's a lot more room for different forms of families. So families become more diverse. Right? It used to be that you married somebody who was very much like you. They were the same race, same ethnicity, same religion, same social class. They were what we call endogamous marriages. But now marriages are becoming a lot more exogamous, right? They're different. You know, when I was a kid, it was understood, hey, you can marry whoever you want, Mike, just so long as she's Italian. Well, you know, I came up in these industrial times. That's no longer the case now, right? And obviously that didn't work out. So, the families, we have a lot more diversity, but we also have, if these families are based on emotions, what happens when those emotions change? Well, if those emotions change, then you change the structure of the family. You may have to dissolve the family because the emotional bounds are not there. The emotional supports are not there. So now we're looking at divorce. Now we're looking at single-parent families. We're looking at, you know, we're looking at combined families. We're looking at, you know, second families, lone parent families, all kinds of your beanpole families, reconstituted families, things like that. A lot of family diversity because there's a lot of variation in human emotions, and human emotions are a lot more complex than economic systems, right? So this stuff starts to happen, and the families then, the roles within the families become more symmetrical. More symmetrical roles in the families, right? And what about extended families? Well, they're still there, right? But extended families are on Facebook, right? Still there. They're still important, and it's still cool to be in touch with Uncle Larry, and you can do that. So this kind of goes over the evolution of the relationship between the family and the state, and how the state has kind of taken on the functions that used to be held by the family. And what does that allow? Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we're going to debate this later on. We'll talk about the different perspectives and how they look at this overlap between the state and the family. But for the most part, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think any of us would like to go back to a situation where marriages were purely done for economic contingency and for property reasons. We like the idea that our families are emotionally based and emotionally responsive and emotionally supportive, and we like the idea that the expectation is that we're going to create our own emotionally based and emotionally supportive families when it becomes our time, and that we're not just going to simply, hey, mom and dad have found your husband or your wife, and they've decided that this would make a good family, arrangement and a good economic, contractual arrangement. So here's your new wife, here's your new husband, bam, like them or not, there it is. I don't think anybody wants to go back to that. Well, that means that somebody else is going to have to take on those functions that happen with that particular kind of structure. And in this case, it's going to be the state. Now, does it have to be the state? Nope. It could be the church. It could be, it could be the military. But in this case, we think that we seem to have put this in the hands of the state, presumably because the state is in the hands of the people. Anyway, hopefully this wasn't too long. I can't see the my timestamp. Oh, 30 minutes. Oh, that's not too bad. That's a lot better than the last one. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. The best way to contact me is through email. One more thing I want to do. I did want to kind of say, one of the things that you can do is talk to people like me. Talk to people my age. Not necessarily like me, because that's a little weird. But talk to people my age, or maybe a little bit older, because we're in a pretty interesting situation in that we actually our generation actually bridges this industrial time and this post-industrial time, and it's really kind of, we do have kind of a fascinating perspective, especially those of us who came up in largely industrial centers, right? From Rhode Island, it was a very industrial place. We saw this transition, we experienced this transition in our lives, right? So we experienced, when I was a kid, my extended family was all around. Now, in fact, I mean, we can even go, I didn't come up in pre-industrial times, but my first house when I was a baby was a house that was owned by my great uncle, right? My grandfather's brother. We lived in their house. We lived in a tenement house. We lived upstairs. They lived downstairs. And my Aunt Mary could just call up, hey, and did. And we finally moved out. Where did we move? Well, we didn't move very far. We moved down the street. We moved to the other side of town. And our extended family was there. I was always around my uncles, my aunts, some of my cousins, right? The furthest away was my cousin who lived in Massachusetts, which was only about an hour, which was an hour and a half away. And it was like, oh my God, to get an hour and a half away, that's like a whole day thing. You had to plan that out ahead of time, right? But everybody else was all around, right? But what happened? Why did that break down? Well, one of the reasons why that breaks down is because a lot of state policies changed, and those state policies opened up economic avenues that caused the breakdown of this industrial economy, right? It's no longer a case where Uncle Jim is going to go and work at the mill for 30 years and retire with a pension, right? That's not going to happen. Those jobs are no longer stable. Those jobs are going to Mexico. Those jobs are going to China, right? The jewelry factories, the pie factory. Yes, there was a pie factory. Those all shut down. They all moved away. And now the economy is a lot less stable. The jobs are a lot less stable, and that destabilizes the society. So now, all right, well, you know what? I don't have necessarily an economic tie to the area. I have family ties to the area, but you know, we have freeways, we have airplanes, we have ways of getting together and meeting with the family. So why not move out? Why not move away? So what is going to happen is, as we move away from this industrial society to a post-industrial society, I could move out to the suburbs, yeah, or I can move to South Florida, right? We have the I-75, we have the I-95. You know, I-75 links the Midwest to South Florida. I-95 links the East to South Florida. I-10 links California to Florida, not South Florida, but we have the means. We have the means to travel. We have the means to communicate. That means it's easier to spread out. So what ended up happening was, in the 1980s, extended family, they were all within maybe a 10-mile radius of each other. But by 1990, we were within 1,000 miles of each other, right? We have people as far up in Rhode Island, we have people in the Carolinas, we have people in South Florida, Central Florida, West Florida, and the Panhandle. We're all over the place now. That's part of this. That's a real life, experience with this transition from industrial societies to post-industrial societies. Now, will you guys be the witnesses to moving from a post-industrial society to the next step, the post-industrial, whatever it is? It does look like there are some changes, that your generation now wants to actually move away from the suburbs and move back into the city. So we're starting to see re-urbanization taking place, what we refer to as gentrification. And how's that going to change the family dynamics? It should be pretty interesting to look at. Anyway, I could go off. This is probably why the last video lasted an hour and something. So I'm going to stop now before I get carried away. If you have any questions, email me. My sociology hours are going to be from 10 to 11 every day, so you can contact me between 10 and 11. And we can have a face-to-face conversation through Zoom. That's linked on Classroom. Make sure that you take a look at the little study guide that I want to attach to this, okay? Take care.